Oh, welcome. Good morning, Pastor Allen. Good morning,
Morning,
James.
Pastor Ken. Good
Wow,
morning, everyone.
James's twin brothers come too today. Okay. Let's get started. Here we go. And as I mentioned, we got quite a bit of things to try to cover here, so we'll just see what the Lord allows for us to be able to do together. Like I said, I do want to do a little bit of diagramming just to continue on that, and then we're going to move forward and look at the next assignment that's due, and I changed the date for that, as I'll show you a little bit later, so that you can finish that. There's a few of you that are still have to turn that in. But before we get to that, let's just talk about diagramming and where we were a couple of weeks ago, before we when we last left off. We were looking at a fourth type of connector word. Again, the first three that we've talked about in detail are the conjunctions, the prepositions, the relative pronouns. And then the fourth group we started discussing last week, and that was the participle. And again, you can think of a participle like a verbal noun. And why is that? Because a participle is a word that has a verb in it. Participle has a verb in it, and then plus an ing or sometimes an ed ending. All right, and it looks like a verb because it has a verb in it, but it doesn't act like a verb. It acts either like an adjective, that is something that modifies a noun, or so often it acts like an adverb, that is something that modifies a verb. And this is an important point to make, is that participles, again, they'll look like a verb, but they'll actually modify something else. They'll modify a noun or a verb, all right? And they always will modify something. A participle never stands by itself, okay? You'll never have a sentence where, I praying today. That's not a participle functioning. This is not a correct sentence. All right, you might say I pray today, or I am praying today. Okay, or you might even say I will be praying today. But the verb there is praying is acting like a verb. All right, because it's connected to a helper. But you would never say in English something like I praying today by itself. Okay, now you might say, yeah, go ahead.
Sometimes we do, Pastor Tim, here in the Philippines.
Yes,
Koreans also.
What's that, Alex?
Koreans also.
Yeah, I know it's a difficulty in English, but actually, we see the same kind of thing in Greek, where you'll see the root verb in the word, and then the ending. It's not an ing ending, of course, but in Greek, there will be another ending that will identify it as a participle. And it's the same with Greek. In Greek, you have what are called finite verbs. That is, they are a standalone action. They are functioning as a verb. But then you have non-finite verbs, which are different, and participles are one of those, in that they look like a verb, but they do not act like a verb. All right, and so you might say something like, instead of I praying today, that's not proper English. You might say I spent time with the Lord praying today. Okay, that's a little bit awkward sentence, but here I spent is the verb, and praying in this case is modifying that verb. It's telling us how we spent time with the Lord. All right, but a participle will not stand alone. There's another verbal. So the verbals in English are participle, okay, which is again the verb plus ing or ed ending. There's also, we looked at this briefly, and we'll come back to it later, maybe in several weeks once we get through the assignments. But affinitive is the word, the preposition to plus a verb. It too is called a verbal. All right. And then finally we have, and we don't have this in Greek, so we're not going to spend any time on it, but it's a noun, and it is a verb plus an ing ending. Okay, and it acts like a noun. Now we're not going to spend time on that particular verbal, but this is just to round out the discussion. These are the three kinds of verbals that we see in English. Greek, typically only participles and infinitives, but in English there's also what's called a gerund. Okay, so again, let's focus our attention on participles. All right, that's what we're here to look at, because a participle functions as a connector word. Infinitives do not, and gerunds do not either, by the way, but a participle does function like a connector word, like we've seen in our little diagram up here. Okay, that is, a participle introduces a phrase, that modifies something else. Okay, so any questions on that before we look at a couple of examples together? All right, that's just a quick review. Now, the trick is in English is looking at whenever you see a verb with an ing ending, to ask yourself, is it functioning like a participle? Is it functioning like a verb? Or could it be a noun? All right, so there are some words that end with ing that are actually a noun. And this is the problem in English. There's going to be some confusion with that. So we'll see an example of that in this passage before us. And with that, we'll start with Michael, since you're at the beginning of my screen. Michael, all I want you to do is just identify what you see in this passage that are participles, okay?
So this I say and affirm together with the Lord. We walk no longer just as the Gentiles also walk in futility of their mind. Being darkened, being in their understanding. Hello? Pastor Tim?
Oh, yeah.
Can you-
I'm sorry, I thought you were just reading. Did you identify one? Can you hear me?
Their understanding.
Okay, so which,
Being darkened, and understanding.
okay, where's the participle?
Understanding, yeah.
Understanding?
Understanding.
Okay. Any others?
Because of hardness of their heart. Having,
okay.
Yeah, I think that's it.
Okay. All right. Are there any others that, Michael, that you see, or anyone else that you might see here in this passage?
I think he said early darkened.
Being darkened. Okay. That one?
Excluded.
Okay. Excluded. All right, good. Any others? Okay, well, let's look at these. So verse 17 doesn't look like there are any that we see there. Verse 18, we have a few possibilities. So being darkened is one. And then you had understanding, and then excluded, and then in verse 19, having become. All right. So we'll just check first to see does it fit the criteria? Is it possible that it could be a participle? And again, remember the criteria is that a participle is a verb plus an ing or ed ending. All right. So as we look at being darkened, we see that it does have the ing or ending, and the darkened is also has the ed ending. So we need to ask ourselves now, how is this functioning here in the sentence? Is it functioning like a participle? So let's look back. What is the main sentence, by the way, Michael, in this? Let's identify that. The main subject and verb here.
So this I say to you, I say that you walk no longer just as Gentiles also walk.
Okay, so what's the subject, the main subject? We'll start there.
Okay. Subject is I.
Good. And then the main verb?
Walk. You
All
walk.
right, so is it saying I walk?
No.
It's not, right? So the
Yeah.
subject you have is correct. What is the main action?
Say.
There you go. Say.
Say.
And also, we have a second action, right?
Yeah.
There's one more main verb in that first verse.
And affirm.
Yes, very good. All right, so I say and affirm. Let's line these up. Okay, so there's two main verbs here. I say and affirm. Now, the object is this that you walk. This is what he says and affirms. That you walk, and we could. All right. So as we get to verse 18, being darkened, that is acting like a participle. Okay, it's not a standalone. There's no subject to being darkened. All right. Now, understanding, that's an interesting word. Let's ask ourselves, is it a verb plus an ing ending? So can understand be a verb?
Yes.
It could be, Pastor Tim.
It can be, right? But in this case, is it acting like a verb? What is the word understanding doing here?
It's a noun, followed by
A
the
noun.
possessive pronoun.
How do you know this? How do you know it's a noun?
It is followed by the possessive pronoun acting as adjective.
There.
Okay, I'm sorry, say that again.
It is the object of the preposition in
Yes.
and followed by a possessive pronoun there.
Oops, okay. Yeah, because it is the object of the preposition in, right? In their understanding. That goes together. That's a phrase here, okay? And notice it begins with the word in, which is a preposition, and prepositions always connect a noun to the sentence, okay? We talked about that earlier when we looked at prepositions. And so in this case, understanding actually is a noun. If you look it up in English dictionary, you would find that the word understanding is a noun. So this is again one of those situations where in English you'll have a word understand that can be a verb. Like if I said I understand you, that would be a verb. But here it's being used. Understanding is used as a noun, with the object of the preposition in. Okay. So this is what makes participles a little bit difficult to identify, because it can look like a participle. There's my ing ending, right? And there's my verb, understand. So this can look like a participle, but in this case, it is not functioning. It is not a participle. It is actually a noun. All right. Now, we'll go in a minute. We will check ourselves with the interlinear, and that'll help us. Okay. You'll see this when you look at the interlinear as well. All right. But for now, we're not doing that yet. So we're just kind of walking through and asking ourselves, how would I know, is this a participle? Is it a finite verb, or is it a noun? Okay. Any questions on that? This was a little bit tricky. Okay. All right. Let's look at the word excluded. Excluded. Being darkened in their understanding, excluded from the life of God. All right. That was identified as a preposition. Now, does it have the form of a preposition? It is a verb plus ed. So it does have the form. The question here is, how do I know that it is a participle and not a past tense verb? What's going to tell me that? Here's my question. How do I know that excluded is not, I'll just do this, is not a past tense verb? How would I know that? If I'm saying it's a participle, I'm saying it's a verbal, that it's modifying a noun or a verb. But how would I know that excluded is not actually from the verb exclude and is past tense? You guys, anyone have an idea how I would figure that out?
Pastor Tim, it describes the prepositional phrase from the life of God. So it's an adjective, so therefore it's a participle.
It describes from the life of God, okay. But it's still, from the life of God could be an object. Potentially. How do I know that it's not a, what's going to tell me for sure, without question, what's going to tell me that it is a participle, not a finite verb, not a regular verb that's in past tense? What does it need? What does a regular verb need or have, actually?
It needs a subject.
Yes. So we would say, okay, is there a subject to this verb excluded? Can we find
We can
one?
understand, Pastor Tim, from the context that is the Gentiles.
Okay, but is it saying, did the sentence say this? The Gentiles are excluded from the life of
Not
God.
explicitly. It is implied, not explicit.
Okay. Yeah, it's describing the Gentiles, but there's a difference between saying the Gentiles are excluded from the life of God versus saying Gentiles, in this case, it's saying no longer walk as the Gentiles walk, excluded from the life of God. Okay, I'm skipping one of the. Okay, notice here something. We have to look at now we're going to look at the context too, as was just mentioned by Sid. Notice we have, let's see, how can I do this? We have two descriptions of the Gentiles here in verse 18. Being darkened in their understanding And then it says excluded from the life of God. Both of those are participial phrases that are modifying the Gentiles, describing the Gentiles in some way. But the Gentiles is not the subject, okay, of these two. These two are being darkened in understanding, excluded from the life of God. Both of those are modifying Gentiles. It doesn't say the Gentiles are darkened in their understanding or that the Gentiles are excluded from the life of God. Okay, Paul's actually using a participle here, at least from this translation. It looks like Paul is using a participle to describe the Gentiles. Okay, so what that would look like is this, if we were diagramming. This I say, and affirm, how? Together with the Lord. And then the object, I affirm, I say that you walk no longer as the Gentiles walk. That is how. Okay. And then he uses these two phrases here describing the Gentiles being darkened. And excluded. I'm just going to I'm going to just leave the rest. You see that? This is what it looks like. And you could figure that out because if you're looking at excluded, you're going, okay, what is the subject of excluded? You won't find one because there isn't one. All right. Now, there is a word, like as Sid said, it's implied as the subject, but really, technically, it's not the subject. It is the word being modified, and that is Gentiles. Okay?
You.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think it's the you, the Ephesians.
Yeah, it's in the context of the whole letter, he's talking about the Ephesians, right? You here, you walk no longer as Gentiles. But here he's distinguishing between you, Ephesians, and the Gentiles. Because he says the Gentiles are the ones who are darkened in their understanding, and the Gentiles are the ones who are excluded from the life of God. He's not saying the Ephesians are. He's saying don't walk like the Gentiles. Now, the Ephesians are certainly Gentiles, but here he's making a distinction. Here he's using Gentiles in the sense of pagans. All right, he's not just saying all Gentiles, all non-Jews are darkened and excluded, okay? Because then he would be saying the Ephesians are darkened and excluded, but they're saved, right? If you go back to the beginning of the letter, he says, saints, you saints at Ephesus. So what he's telling them here is, don't walk like your former pagan selves. Don't walk like pagans. Don't walk like non-believers. And that word Gentile, I would have translated it as pagan, because the word ethnos can be used to talk about Gentiles, but also it can be used to talk about pagans. That is non-God-fearing people. Okay? So here he's making a contrast. He's telling the Ephesians, don't walk like the pagans who are darkened, who are excluded. And then he says, why? Why are they darkened? Why are they excluded? And that's where we would put that here. They are darkened, they are excluded because of, and then he goes on to say, because of the ignorance and because of, because of the ignorance, and then secondly, because of hardness of their heart. Notice in verse 19, he gives the two reasons. Okay? All right, so really what you would need to be doing here is And when we get to the third step, I'll show you this. You're breaking down each of the phrases and clauses. And what we would be doing here is recognizing that being darkened and excluded from are separate phrases and clauses that are modifying another word in the sentence. Okay. I think if you have questions or you're not following this, when we look at the interlinear, that'll be, I think, a helpful guide in this process. Now we have a third participle, having become, here in verse 19. All right. Now we're going to ask ourselves, having become, so having is a verb have plus ing ending, so it could be a participle. The second question we want to ask is, does it have a subject? If it has a subject, then it is not a participle. Okay? So let's ask that question. Does it have a subject? That is there someone doing the action, and the action is having become? If that makes sense. What do you think, Alan?
So it brings us back to the Gentiles being the subject.
Okay, yeah, they refers to the Gentiles.
How I see it.
Okay, so let's make sure we want to make sure we understand. There's the grammar and semantics. All right. Oops, wrong size here. We want to make sure we understand the difference between these two things. Okay, every form of communication has grammar. That is, it has rules of grammar that in the English language, in the Greek language, there are a subject, there is a verb, there are various parts of speech. A subject is the one doing the action, the verb is the action. Sometimes there's an object, that's what's receiving the action. There are then also other parts of speech like nouns and adverbs and these kinds of things. So there's a grammar, there are rules of grammar, okay? But then there's also what are the semantics. That is the meaning that's being conveyed through that grammar, all right? So as Alan just said, if we want to look at verse 19 here, if we're looking at verse 19 and the word they, who does that refer to? Alan, what did you say?
Gentiles. The Gentiles.
Okay, it refers to the Gentiles or pagans back in verse 17, right? You guys see that? Okay, this pronoun they refers back to Gentiles. Now, that's the semantics, that's the meaning, that's the connection that we can see here. But in the sentence in verse 19, they is the subject of the verb have given. All right? Gentiles is not the subject of the verb have given.
So it's the they.
They is the subject. Gentiles is the subject. If we go back to, oops, sorry, this should be verse 19. If we go back to verse 17, Gentiles is the subject of the verb walk. Okay, look. That you walk, so there's a subject here. You walk, verb, no longer as the Gentiles walk. Subject, Gentiles, verb, walk. Here, I'll put them in the same font so you can see the link. Okay, so grammatically, Gentiles is the subject of the verb walk. Now, semantically, Gentiles is being modified by being darkened. It's modified by excluded. It is the them refers to the Gentiles. Their heart refers to the Gentiles. They refers to the Gentiles. Themselves. Okay, so the topic of this sentence is the Gentiles. But that's the semantics. That's the meaning being conveyed. When we look at the grammar, we have to understand in grammar there are parts of speech. So Gentile is not the subject of the verb have given. They is the subject of the verb have given. Now, they means the Gentiles. It's referring to the Gentiles. But grammatically, the sentence in verse 19 is, they have given themselves over. So that's what we would say in verse 19.
So, Pastor Tim,
Yes.
technically, what is being modified is the word they, but semantically, it's the Gentiles.
Yes.
Am I correct?
There you go. And by semantics, you can just think of the word meaning. Grammar would be the rules of communication, the rules that govern the communication. Semantics is the meaning of that communication. It's taking the rules of grammar and then putting it all together and saying, this is what it means. All right, so if we are to, let me see if I can, I'll just recopy this down here. That'll probably make it easier. Okay, so verse 19, the clause there, they have given themselves over, is the clause. Okay, that is grammatically the subject and the verb. They have given themselves over. Now, we have other phrases that modify something in that clause. So, for example, having become callous. You see that in verse 19? Having become does not have a subject because they have given. They is the subject of have given. Having become, then, is a participle modifying they. It's describing they. Who are they? The Gentiles. So in the meaning of this, yes, having become callous is telling us something about the Gentiles, but in terms of the grammar, specifically, having become callous is modifying the word right before it, they. So it's important to understand when you're doing exegesis, you have the grammar, the rules, and those rules tell you, here is a subject, here is a verb, here is a word that modifies the verb, here's a phrase that modifies the subject, here's a connector word that connects this noun to the verb, right? That's grammar. That's all the rules that say how a phrase or a clause or a word functions in a is connected in a sentence. But the semantics tell us the meaning. That it's what the grammar leads us to. All right, so that's why when Pastor Allen said earlier, they refers to the Gentiles, that is exactly correct. Grammatically, we would say they is the pronoun whose antecedent or the noun that it modifies is Gentiles. Now, how do we know that? Because we look for the nearest possibility. And they, in verse 19, we would go back to their. Okay, that's another pronoun. There, we would go back to them. And then them, the nearest possible word that it modifies, goes back to, it doesn't go to God, right? God is not the reference of them. It doesn't match grammatically, right? God is singular. Them is plural. And then secondly, it goes back to, okay, there. Okay? So all we're doing here is we're tracing they. They is a pronoun. A pronoun replaces a noun. It represents a noun. and we're looking for that noun somewhere up higher in the paragraph. So we just go to there in verse 18. It's the same pronoun. That's the same reference. Them, it's the same reference. Okay, we have a noun, God. Nope, it's not God that it's referring to. We have another noun, life. Nope, that's not a person, so you would not use a pronoun for that. We keep going back. There's the word there. Okay, that's the same, referring to the same thing. Let's go back. It's not the noun futility. That's not a person. Gentiles. All right, there it is. Did you follow that process? If you didn't, ask the question, okay? I want to make sure this is clear. All right? So, grammar is what told us where to look for the noun that the pronoun's modifying, because a pronoun by its definition represents a noun. Okay? And so grammatically, we know that pronoun they is connected to a noun somewhere. Now, semantically, the meaning is identifying that noun, and it's Gentiles. Okay? Now, that noun they is not referring to you. Okay, those are different. Now, if we wanted to find you, we would have to go back up further before verse 16 to see who the you is. Okay? And we would find back, I think it's in verse 11 or 12, that he's referring to the Ephesians there. And that makes sense because the letter is the letter to the Ephesians. But I think it's really important that you're able to distinguish or differentiate, separate the idea of there's grammar and then there's semantics. Grammar are the rules that, and the parts of speech, the rules that tell how words work together. The semantics is actually the meaning that comes from those words working together. All right. Now, a diagram incorporates both. A diagram, a block diagram, a structural diagram, we use grammar to help guide us, but it also, we have to think about it in terms of meaning as well. When we try to identify what word or phrase is being modified, that's where semantics will come in, all right? Now, for the purpose of what we're trying to do in this verse, we're just identifying participles. But as you can see, it's really hard to just separate and isolate one thing, right? All of this is interconnected together. Now, let me show you from the interlinear. Let's say you go through all this. You think you've identified the participles. Let me see if I can get my Bible Hub going here. Okay. Hopefully you can see. Can you see the Bible Hub page opened? Okay, good. I've got it open to Ephesians 4. So we're going to go down to verse 17. And we're going to see if, we're going to confirm if those words that we identified as participles from the translation are indeed participles in the original. Okay, so here we go. Again, the red here is the literal translation, and then the blue below it tells us the parts of speech, the grammatical function, all right, or the grammar, the grammatical, the part of speech, the grammar that it's following. So, this, therefore I say, and testify in the Lord, no longer you to walk as the Gentiles are walking in the futility of the mind, Okay, and here was being darkened. That was the first one we thought was a participle. Now let's look at it. In the description there, in the parsing, does it say participle? Can you guys see it?
Perfect participle present.
There you go. Perfect participle. So one, we confirm, yes, it's a participle. Two, we confirm also it is a perfect participle. Now, I think we talked about that last time. Remember, in Greek, there's present, future, aorist, and then there's this verb tense, this verb aspect called perfect. Does anybody remember what a perfect tense in Greek indicated?
Continuous action.
It's a previous action, so it's an action that happened in the past, but there's one other element to it. Do you remember?
A continual action. It will continue in the future, Pastor Tim.
It's a past action which has
Effect
Effect.
at the future.
or consequences in the present. All right. Now, a pluperfect would also have the indication of present and future. A perfect tense is typically an action in the past that has results in the present. Okay? An action in the past that has results in the present. So we learn two things by looking at the interlinear here. One, we learn, yes, it's a participle. That means there's no subject. It doesn't stand alone. It's modifying something else in the sentence. That's the first thing we learn. The second thing we learn is because it is a perfect participle, Paul's describing something that happened in the past but describes their present state. Okay, being darkened. So he's saying that's a characteristic of these Gentiles that in the past, and technically, how far back would we go, by the way? Here's a theological question. When were the minds of man darkened?
At the fall of man.
Yeah. So we're going all the way, an act that happened at the beginning of human history or close to it. That's when men's minds were darkened. Okay? Anyway, that's theological. So we have grammar, semantics, and theology here, all right? So there's different layers going on. But anyway, as far as the grammar is concerned, we have a perfect participle. The grammar tells us that this means it's a verb root, but it's not a verbal, it doesn't act like a verb. In this case, it's acting like an adjective because it's modifying Gentiles, okay? And secondly, again, we learn grammatically from the grammar that the type of tense this is, the Greek perfect tense, tells us that it is an action in the past that has results in the present. Okay? Are there any questions on this? This is, by the way, very important because when you're talking about the Gentiles being darkened in their understanding, he's not saying the Gentiles did something that caused this. He's describing their state. And again, theologically, we know that it's going all the way. What is the past act? Well, it goes back to Adam, that first sin. And Eve, technically, right? Adam and Eve, that first sin was the act that still has effect in the present or results in the present. That, by the way, are continuing into the future because it's the same for us today, right? Without Christ, we are darkened in our understanding. Okay, and notice as well, being darkened. And then let's keep going. The next participle, let's see if I think being alienated, right? Was the next one. Let's confirm that. Okay, we have the verb being here. Let's see. Does it tell us that it's a participle? You see that?
Present participle.
It's a present participle. Here's a little difference now. One, it's a participle, so we know it's not a finite verb. It's not acting like a verb here. It is acting like an adjective or an adverb. In this case, an adjective It's modifying Gentile again. But here it is present tense, not perfect. What is the difference? Why might that be significant? Any ideas?
Come again, Pastor Tim. I'm sorry. I missed the question.
Sir, no problem. Being darkened was a perfect tense, meaning past act with results in the present. Being alienated or separated is a present tense participle. So it is also a participle, but it's present tense, not perfect. Present tense means ongoing now, happening now. Why might this be significant? Or what would be an important thing to understand with these two participles? One's a perfect, this one's a present.
Maybe it highlights the
result.
continuing continuing state of the Gentiles.
Yes.
Maybe it is highlighting that.
Okay, good. Michael, did you have a comment too?
I think that's maybe the result of being darkened and being darkened in the past, and it's being continued today, and we are being alienated.
Yeah, there's this, he's describing two different things here. Okay, one, he's describing the fact that Gentiles, pagans, are darkened in their understanding, being darkened. So it's a participle, meaning it's modifying the Gentiles, and it's describing their condition. An act in the past. Yeah, Pastor Bobby?
I'm sorry. The first one is a state. No, one is a state and the other one is a condition.
Yeah, the being alienated or being separated is describing an ongoing present condition. Now, whenever you have a present tense verb or a present tense participle, it is emphasizing the ongoing state of things. A perfect participle is focusing on the fact that there was a past action that has consequences in the present. A present participle is focusing on the fact that it's an ongoing situation now. And it's continuous.
Their current status, Pastor Tim.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And so again, we are now in the English translation, this being alienated was actually translated excluded. If you remember, that's how the New American Standard translated it. So, so it is excluded in the New American Standard is a participle because it is coming from this being alienated. It's coming from that Greek term. And the New American Standard chose to translate it as excluded rather than being alienated, but it's still a participle. Okay. And then yeah, go ahead, Noor.
Okay, Pastor Bobby.
Pastor Tim.
Yeah.
For example, here in the interlinear, we found out that it is a participle. Okay. But in the as you were explaining earlier, if we look at it in the English translation, it doesn't look that way.
Actually, it does, because excluded is a verb with an ed ending. And again, participles can have an ed ending. It's just often verbs with an ed ending in English are past tense verbs, but they can be a participle. Now, I wish the New American Standard had just translated it as being alienated. I think that would have made it clearer, right? But excluded is a participle in the English It is functioning that way. Because again,
Okay.
we confirmed that because we looked and there was no subject to that verb, to that word excluded. It had no subject. So it had to be, it could not be a regular verb in the past tense.
Mhm.
But yeah, it's a little bit harder to see that. It's more confusing. The ESV, let me see what the ESV did with that. Ephesians 4. The ESV also put excluded. No, I'm sorry, that's NAS. Oh, but the New American Standard does have a footnote. No, alien. Okay, that doesn't help. ESV says alienated. So they too chose to do the participle with the ed ending. So not as clear. The NIV has the NIV really made it a noun, actually. So we won't talk about it. NIV is typically just a good version to read, not a good version to study. The New King James Version, being alienated. So the New King James did more closely match the Greek text. And let me just look at the Net Bible. The Net Bible, being alienated. Okay, so a couple English translations did stick with being alienated, which makes it a little bit easier to see. All right. Okay.
Pastor Tim,
Yes, sir.
can I take the opportunity to ask you, what is your experience with the Net Bible?
I use the Net Bible as a resource when I study because
Okay.
sometimes it will have a footnote on. So, for example, let's just look and see what we have here. All right. Hopefully you can see the Net Bible translation there on your screen. So notice there's lots of footnotes here the Net Bible has. Let's see if they have one for verse 18. Yeah, so notice they have this footnote. In the Greek text, this clause is actually subordinate to walk. Now notice they're explaining some grammar here in verse 17. So they're saying this clause, notice they use the term clause, which is correct. They, subject, are darkened, verb. So that is a clause. This clause is actually subordinate to the verb peripate, which is the verb walk or live. They translate it live. It was broken up in the English translation to avoid unnecessary long and cumbersome statement. Okay, so at least they're telling you what they're doing. Instead of saying being darkened in their understanding, they chose to translate it as a clause. They are darkened. Now they should have translated it as being darkened, but they didn't. But then they did translate being alienated. So this is why I like the New American Standard, tries to be as close to the Greek as it can. All right. And in this case, it's much closer. But what I'd like, so I don't use the Net Bible as my study translation. I use it as a resource because sometimes it will have a comment on a word. Let me see if it does here. Yeah. So here, if you're doing a word study, you can use the Net Bible as a resource. Notice for that word greediness in verse 19, here it tells you refers to an increasing desire for more and more. The point is that sinful passion desires are never satisfied. So here it's basically giving you a summary of a word study. Okay? That can be helpful. So the thing I like about the Net Bible is that it does provide, occasionally it will provide a grammar comment, a semantic comment, or sometimes like a word study comment.
Yeah.
But the problem with the Net Bible is the translations aren't as literal as the New American Standard or the ESV. So, but the Net Bible, you can get access to it online. That's why it's called the Net Bible, the New English Translation, and they chose that on purpose to have NET because they wanted to put it on the internet to make it available. Dr. Barrick, if you remember him, he actually did editing for the book of Job, I think it is. So he was one of the editors for that book. So they have some good scholars for some of the books. But I have noticed some of the others, like the Psalms, oftentimes the translations are not accurate, or at least in my opinion. Some of the New Testament books, it's the same thing. But like I said, the footnotes are a helpful resource. So long answer to a short question, but is that?
Yeah. Thank you, Pastor Tim.
So I would
Because-
encourage, oh, go ahead, Bobby. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, I turned to the Net Bible for additional checking because of their footnotes. I basically appreciate it also for the footnotes.
Yeah. Yeah, you just have to be a little more careful with it. You know, again, it's like a commentary. The footnotes are like a commentary. So it is the opinion of the translator, you know, but it can be a helpful guide and resource, just like a commentary or a study Bible. Okay. So I think it's a good resource overall. But when I'm doing diagramming, I don't use the Net Bible for that. I might refer to it like I did here, just to see how do they translate being alienated. And in this case, they translated it well. So when we go to the, let's go back to the,
Interlinear.
Let's go back to the interlinear for a moment. Okay, there was one more participle that we had identified in the verse. That was in verse 19. Having become callous, I think was the, oh, look at this. There's another participle in the Greek that we didn't catch in the English. Being alienated from the life of God because of the ignorance, and in the English translation it said that is in them. But notice here it says being in them. And as we look at the parts of speech there, notice it says it's a present participle. So we have a present participle being in them, which is modifying ignorance. The ignorance is an ongoing condition. So in the New American Standard, it translates it, it said that because of the ignorance that is in them, really it could have and should have said the ignorance being in them, but that's more confusing to understand. So I think they chose to put the word that in order to try to make it a little more clear. But in the Greek, there's an emphasis on the ongoing state or condition of, or the ongoing characteristic of the ignorance, that it is always in them. Does that make sense? If you know that you have a participle here, that can actually add to your understanding of what the author is doing. And in this case, Paul is emphasizing this ignorance, it's always in them. It's part of their nature. It's an ongoing characteristic of these Gentiles, of these pagans. Why? Because of, on account of the hardness of the heart, their heart. Okay, who, again, going back to the Gentiles, pagans, who, having cast off all feeling. This is the other participle, which was translated as having become callous. Let's see, is this a participle? All right. Let's ask Sid here on this one. what do we see about this one? Do we have a participle there? That's the one translated having become callous or having cast off all
Perfect.
feeling.
Perfect participle active.
So what does that tell us?
It's a participle.
Yeah.
It tells us that that's happening in the past and that has an effect at the present and to the future.
Yeah. So, but again, we're confirmed that it is in fact a participle that is perfect in this case, a perfect tense. So it's a past act with results in the present. And it too is modifying, technically it's modifying the they. Back up in verse, they having become callous. Okay. Let me make a comment about the interlinear, and then I want to go to the assignment number 5 and discuss that. We'll come back. We'll do some more examples on this in the future. We'll keep looking at these, because the more examples we do, then the more hopefully the more we are learning as far as the different ways the grammar works. Okay. Next week we'll try to do another example, and then we'll look at putting all of these connector words together and focusing on that. But I want to get to assignment 5. But before I do that, let me just make a comment about interlinears. I'll take you back to the notes. Okay. Come back to that passage next week. Just a couple cautions about using interlinears. Okay. These Greek, or if we were looking at an Old Testament verse, a Hebrew, Greek or Hebrew interlinears are very helpful. It's a very helpful resource. BibleHub.com, BlueLetterBible.org. You can get access to them very easily online, or a lot of the Bible software today programs have that. So it's a really nice tool, especially for all of us who are not experts in Greek or Hebrew. Maybe many of us, we haven't really studied the language very much, except maybe for a word study or something like that. So it's a very helpful tool. It's helpful for us not only in analyzing these verbs, and finding, is this a participle? Is this a finite verb? What kind of verb is it? Is it active or passive? What's the tense? Interlinear can be very helpful in that, but we have to recognize that there are a lot of Greek grammar has a lot of rules. Okay, just like English grammar has a lot of rules. And because we don't know all of the rules, we have to be very careful how strongly we emphasize something we might learn from an interlinear, looking at an interlinear, okay? Because there are times, for example, let me show you one example from this verse we just looked at. Okay, go back to Ephesians 4. Where was it? Yeah, here we go. Verse 17. This therefore I say and testify in the Lord, no longer you to walk as the Gentiles are walking. Now, I mentioned to you before, we talked about infinitives before. Here is an example of an infinitive, to walk. The preposition to plus the verb. Now, I told you earlier that infinitive is a verbal. That is, that it has the characteristics of a verb, but doesn't function exactly like a verb. Now here, literally the translation is no longer you to walk. Now the you is in the form of an object. Okay, it's taking on what's called an accusative case. So technically, if we were just looking at it literally, we would say no longer to walk you. But in Greek, this exact construction, an accusative with an infinitive, actually functions like a subject and a verb. You'd walk. All right. And so you have to be careful to go in and say, oh, look, I have an infinitive, and infinitives function this way. They're not a finite verb. They modify something else, blah, blah, blah. Actually, you would be wrong in this case, because in Greek grammar, sometimes an infinitive can function like a regular verb. Now, you'd have to know Greek to understand that. So here's where you just want to be careful. Now, some of you might be saying, you know, what are we talking about here? All I'm trying to do is just show an example where you really do need to know the Greek grammar to be more effective in understanding what the interlinear is telling you. So I think what's the safest thing to do to use the interlinear is just note the kind of verb that you have. So is it a participle? Is it imperative? Is it interrogative? Is it, you know, so look at the verb just to see what kind of verb it is. And then also the characteristics of the verb. So for example, let me go back to the notes here. So remember we talked about for a verb, we talked about there's the mood, right? Which is the imperative, interrogative, right? The indicative, remember that? We talked about those, the subjunctive. So just look for the mood, the tense, and in English it's past, present, and future. In Greek you have aorist, present, perfect, future. And then the voice, active, passive, middle in Greek. Okay, so those are helpful things to look for as far as the verbs. So we can use the interlinear to confirm if we have a participle, or confirm if it's a past tense or present tense, and also tell us the voice, is it active or passive? Those are things that can be helpful, but be careful how much you, how far you emphasize certain things, just because we don't have a mastery of the Greek language, or Hebrew if you were looking at a Hebrew word. So I just want to caution us that we don't get that at this stage, until you begin taking some Greek and learning the Greek grammar, just be careful how much you use the Greek. So let me show one more example. Hebrews. Let's go to, let me show an example from Hebrews 10. Okay. Hebrews chapter
10, the turning point.
Yeah, the turning point of the, okay. And then down in verse 19 is the hinge of the letter, where it turns from the indicative to the imperative. Let me just go to, as he begins the imperatives, there's three. He says, let us draw near, let us hold fast, and let us not forsake. All right, and let me see if, okay, now, let me see. Okay, here's the first one. We should draw near. All right, that's the let us draw near, it's translated as. Now let's look at it. If we were to do looking at our interlinear, and we look, okay, it's present tense, subjunctive, middle verb. Okay, you guys all see that? Now, what is a subjunctive mood? Does anyone remember?
Conditional.
Okay, it's conditional. So an imperative is a command, right? Interrogative is a question. Indicative is a statement. Subjunctive is like a condition. It's actually it introduces a probability. In English, we might say we might, or we should, or we may draw near. Subjunctive normally indicates some degree of doubt. Like, you know, I should exercise, or I may exercise.